Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We're here to talk about consumer expectations. Specifically, we're going to talk through some of the findings from Sandpiper's Consumer Expectation Index. There will be a short presentation of the key findings, followed by a moderated panel discussion and an audience Q&A. I think it's a really important conversation because we're looking at changing consumer attitudes, challenges and opportunities for organizations across the region. And the research also asks critical questions that corporates need to answer as we emerge into the post-COVID era, into another era, I guess, that continues to be marked by considerable uncertainty and volatility. So there is a lot going on. There's a lot to discuss. My name is Arun Sulam, and I'm CEO and Editor-in-Chief at PRovoke Media. Before I hand over to the research presentation, I would like to introduce the other panelists. We're very lucky to be joined today by Marla Garin Alvarez, who's the VP and Head of the Sustainability Office at BDO Unibank. Also joining us is Derek Coe, Director of Corporate and Public Affairs at the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And Justin Lam, who's the market CEO at Nestlé Nespresso for Hong Kong and Macau. So thank you all to the panelists for joining us. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the research presenter, who is Sandpiper Chief Operating Officer, Kelly Johnson. Kelly, over to you.
Thank you very much, Arun, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So as Arun's outlined, we'll be doing a short whistle-stop tour of the key findings of our Consumer Expectation Index today prior to our moderated panel discussion. So this is a very in-depth study. It's a repeat of a study we actually conducted at the outset of COVID-19 in 2020. The only difference this time around is that rather than covering just 6 markets in the Asia-Pacific region, our 2022 edition covers 11 markets. These are, as you can see, Australia, China, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So it is a very wide-ranging study of consumers across the region. We interviewed somewhere between 500 and 1,000 consumers in each market, depending on population for the study. The areas that have been focused on that consumer expectations consumers have of public and private sector organizations, and also their leadership around sustainability issues and sustainable development. So on the coming slides, we just have pulled out some of the key findings and headlines. So the first of these is that sustainable development goals are actually more widely understood than we realize. This is particularly true in emerging markets versus developed markets, where there seems to be higher understanding and concern overall around sustainability issues, most likely because these markets are more at risk and more affected. The issues are more present. The next finding is that climate change is no longer a debate. There is no longer a climate debate. 96.8% of consumers across all markets believe that climate change is reality. And this is across all demographics, from young to old. Thirdly, consumers aren't connecting their concerns with their behaviours. And so, for example, in areas such as the use of single-use plastics, concerns actually grew between 2020 and 2022, but also so did the number of people against a ban on them. This is, again, was particularly seen in terms of against a ban in more developed markets, where this is disconnect between concerns and actual behaviours. The fourth point, language matters. So consumers understand the issues, but outside of the sustainable development goals and some other terminology, and when you start to get into more technical terms such as ESG, for example, these terms are not widely understood, which really draws back to the point that we should all know as communicators about using simple language and sticking to the issues when it comes to talking about these matters as an organization. Next, we have seen a shift in the issues over the past 2 years that people care about. This is probably the area where there was the most shift across the study. So collectively across all markets in the region that we looked at, poverty, climate change, ocean pollution, and unemployment came out as the issues that are of most concern. Next, we see that consumers believe that when it comes to the different actors around these issues, governments are making the strongest contribution towards solving environmental sustainability challenges when zeroing in on that area specifically. This is followed very far behind actually by the private sector, and then consumers ranking themselves last in terms of their performance in that particular area. We also see growing polarization in the results but over the past 2 years. So, for example, when looking at the performance of governments, while more people believe that governments are performing more strongly around sustainability challenges and addressing them than 2 years ago, more also believe that they are underperforming than 2 years ago, which really highlights this polarization we've seen as a general trend across the results. Then finally, we see that 1 in 10 consumers across all the markets see 5 sectors being singled out as those which are generally acting at the far end irresponsible or non-compliant in relation to sustainability challenges, and these industries are mining, incidentally, government and public service, energy, financial services, and construction and engineering. So those are the top 8 findings that we've pulled out, and looking forward to discussing these today.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Some very interesting findings there, and some are quite surprising, I would say, given everything we've seen over the past couple of years. So let's start with one that I think is perhaps one of the, I wouldn't say the most surprising, but maybe took some of us by surprise, which is there is quite a high level of understanding among the general population around sustainability and SDGs. And so I wanted to ask the panelists whether they in fact did find that surprising, and if not, how they're seeing that play out in their own businesses. So Derek, if you don't mind, if I could start with you.
Hi, Arun. Yes, I think it's interesting. I was actually quite surprised when I see that it's 60% of SDGs being widely understood. If you say awareness, I'd be, yeah, okay, widely understood, but the results point to what they are. So it's very heartening. I find it very reassuring that people understand what is being talked about on a global level. I think the next level is then understanding what impact it would be at the local level, and then what it means for local governments, businesses, NGOs, and then consumers at the heart of it all, making the decisions, making choices that would help in these SDGs. And then some people I know would personally put down what their personal SDGs would be. I mean, corporates are increasingly expected to put that in their sustainability reports and make open declarations on their websites. But I like to also find out how many people would be interested in adopting that at the personal level, then leaving it all to somebody else to do it. Yeah. So
there's an understanding of SDGs, but perhaps it's at a kind of a level up there rather than at ground level in terms of impacting personal lives. Justin, over to you. Your thoughts?
Hi, Arun. Look, I have 2, I guess, examples here that I would like to offer to the forum here. I agree with Derek that I think it's very heartening that this is something that is top of mind. In our retail business, what we find is that what the consumers think of as sustainability and topics like this can be very different to what those of us who are sort of in the industry or are practitioners would be thinking of. So I give that one of the examples I want to give is that if we operate in a market that mostly speaks Chinese, and if you look at the Chinese term for sustainability, it actually just means can be continued. So when we talk about things like that, I think people generally feel that they have an idea of what it is. If you ask them, they'll say, yes, we understand what sustainability, but it's very hard for me to give you an example of what that means. Now, when we start talking, but if you look at, say, green living, I mean, the word for that has been around for more than 20 years. That word literally means protect the environment in Chinese. Now, so when we talk to people about that, then they automatically make that link. So that they see, oh, so this is about, protecting the environment. And then we hear people talk about, using less plastic, growing trees, very simple things that they can sort of name. But we do find that, yeah, if you ask people whether this is something that is top of mind, the answer is usually yes. But if you try to sort of peel the onion a little bit down another layer, you get a lot of very different type of interpretations based on what are the kind of people that you're talking to and what their personal experiences are. And I think the second part, and I also sort of echo something there that Derek mentioned, is really about what happens locally. We've been running a recycling program for more than 10 years in Hong Kong, and we still have people who either think that we don't recycle or doesn't really believe that recycling actually takes place. And a big part of it is because we talk about working with, say, at the very beginning of the journey, we talk about working with coffee farms in coffee growing regions. Now, most people don't know much about farming, and it's certainly not something that they're keen to talk about. And at the same time, if the action is happening too far away, and if they can't see it, feel it, and touch it, there's also a credibility issue here. So I guess what we also see is that there's this concept around how what you say and what you do, and sort of what's the gap between that, especially when it comes to sustainability. I guess we'll say that the interest is certainly there, but I suppose as businesses, we probably need to give our consumers and our customers more of an opportunity to do, because I think that's really the only way that we can drive engagement beyond just communicating and talking about the key messages.
Thanks, Justin. A couple of things there that I think we will discuss in more detail in this session. First, around that kind of gap, which I think opens up the potential for a backlash against potential greenwashing, for example. And secondly, just around the opportunity to help consumers change their own behavior. We'll get to that next, but Marla, I wanted to come to you to see how you view the high levels of understanding when it comes to sustainability and SDGs and how that's impacting your work. Do you think that is the whole story here?
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Well, for me, it's not a surprise, mainly because I know that the SDGs are taught in school, from elementary to high school to college nowadays. And so part of that is also looking at case studies as it applies to the Philippines specifically, since our country is very vulnerable to climate change. So you relate the lesson to the actual experience of people to make it easier to understand. At the same time, I have also noticed that multinational companies in the Philippines do use the SDGs as a framework for their corporate social responsibility activities. And so, for example, if you do a CSR activity, themes would revolve around poverty, for example, or gender equality, or around addressing hunger. So that makes it easier to understand and relate to. For BDO in particular, on the sustainability side, we recently conducted a materiality assessment survey where we ask our stakeholders, and that includes our customers, in terms of what they see as the bank's environmental and social impact, and vice versa, what are the environmental and social issues that they think will impact the bank's performance and financial operations. And what we found out is among our stakeholders, it's really our customers, or the general public, who have showed a higher level of understanding of sustainability topics and issues, and a higher consciousness of prioritizing environmental impact, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly around the geophysical impact of climate change in their specific areas. So that's how I see it. That's my reading of this finding.
Thanks, Amala. And Kelly, did you have any thoughts on this you perhaps wanted to share in terms of whether I mean, you're working across a lot of these consumer issues every day. Did it surprise you to see such a high level of understanding?
Somewhat. Yes, I'm surprised it's so high, but also I think we need to take it as an indication of where consumer trends are heading. Definitely people are becoming more educated and more knowledgeable in this space. We need to acknowledge that people have a deeper understanding now in terms of the average person in the street about sustainability issues. They care more, they're willing to do the research, they're willing to look into it more, and as a byproduct of that are increasing their knowledge. And I think we see that across the industry translating and as increasing scrutiny of companies where that's warranted, increasing discussions around areas such as greenwashing. Even though it's been around for a really long time, it's certainly amplified in recent times. I think we need to acknowledge where that's going and take notice as communicators.
Yes, indeed. So, by the way, everyone, if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free. Please use the Q&A box. That will be very helpful. And send them through, and I'll try and make sure as many of them get answered as possible by our panel. So next question I wanted to ask is around climate change, because there are a few findings here that are interesting, but the one I think that really came out was that clearly that, whatever the debate was, it's over. There's 97% believe in it. It's very clearly a hot button issue. I think it's one that all of us here, all of the panelists are kind of keenly invested in. 2/3 of those surveyed indicate that business should be prioritizing environmental protection over profits, which is quite an interesting finding. So I'm curious to see how each of you is acknowledging this and acting on this in your own business. And perhaps, Justin, if I could start with you, please.
Sorry, Erin, I think I just lost some of your audio.
Oh, sure. So 2/3 of those surveyed indicated that business should be prioritizing environmental protection over profits. So the question was how you are acknowledging and acting on that kind of finding in your own business.
Yeah, look, I think for us, again, two things I would offer there. We've been running our recycling program for more than 10 years. So I think that costs money, but I think we also realize that is part of, I guess, our responsibility as a company to promote this sort of the circularity of coffee. Now, I would say that in the current inflationary environment, I think consumers are looking for more. I would say that they're looking for more value for what they're paying. They don't necessarily want to trade down, but they certainly want to see the value. So in a way, it's up to us to, I guess, build that into our cost structure. I would say that this is not something that we can reasonably expect consumers to pay more of just because this is the right thing to do. I think the responsibility is definitely on our end. And the other data point I would offer to this is that, at least from what we've observed, I think participation beyond people who are very passionate about the subject still requires an incentive. We find that when we're running programs around recycling and sustainability, the participation rate goes up substantially if there's an incentive at the end of that. Now, I think that's perfectly fair, because the fact is that for people to be part of this and to sort of support whatever a corporation would be able to do and to be participatory into all that, it needs them to, it means that you have to do something. And I think people expect that they're going to get some sort of reward for it. I get it. But I guess I would say that it's probably up to all of us to sort of improve the infrastructure so that we can make all of these things more accessible. I think to the point that I made earlier, in coffee, we've talked about the kind of work that we do in coffee origins for many, many years. I think these are too far away. I think the consumers, especially in Asian markets, they would like to see it happening at their doorsteps. And it, as hard, we might say that it's very hard, but it's up to us to find the solution for that.
Excellent, thanks. So more incentives, more accessibility, and more local, I guess, are the three big takeaways. Marla, over to you. I'm curious to hear how you're working through these issues at BDO. In particular, also, one of the findings in the study, the financial sector is not particularly well perceived, right, when it comes to acting on environmental issues. So talk us through how these things are affecting your work.
Thanks, Arun. So, three things, I guess. The first one is that sustainability in general is a growing field. You see a lot of job openings now looking for sustainability officers, both at the entry level, mid level, and very senior level, on the chief sustainability officer role level. And that means that companies are really practically forced to consider this and establish a center of excellence or a subject matter expertise on this within their organizations. ESG expertise and consultancy as well is a growing business, which also again shows you how climate change has become both an opportunity and a challenge. And there are companies and individuals whose expertise are needed to address both. The second item is that banks in particular, the financial industry or institutions, banks in particular recognize that we have a critical role to play in terms of financing climate change mitigation and adaptation, because we need to mobilize private sector funds so that we can finance what is estimated to be at around 1.3 trillion US dollars needed daily for mitigating activities. And within that, um, for banks too, such as BDO, our one of our pioneering initiatives is sustainable finance, which we have been doing since 2010. And that is in terms of financing renewable energy projects for solar, wind, biomass, hydro, and geothermal nationwide in the Philippines, and also financing energy efficiency and green buildings. Now, when it comes to government or regulators, since banks are heavily regulated, they have been doing a very critical role in terms of creating policies, mandating policies practically for banks to transition into a sustainable finance framework. And what that means is to really embed sustainability principles in our corporate governance, in our risk management systems, in our business strategies, and in our operations. So really that practically covers everything that the bank does. So that's how the financial sector is looking and responding to this. And banks like BDO in particular, we know that for us as the largest bank in the country, there's a lot that we can contribute in terms of impact.
Thank you. Derek, do you think that there is enough acknowledgement on the business side, given the results from this study, given that 2/3 of those surveyed think business should be prioritizing environmental protection over profits? Is that message getting through from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it is, but obviously we're on a journey and not at the destination yet. I think we're far off. But a lot of the thinking from the business side has shifted or is shifting towards how do we transform or transition to a circular economy. And businesses, not just businesses, but everyone plays a role. If we talk about businesses, I think many of them are starting to think about in a products business, designing for circularity or designing for recyclability. So you're trying to get the product starting point in the right gear or the right path for it to have a circular, the virtuous cycle. So for example, food packaging. How do you reduce the number of composite layered type of plastic film or even thin films or flexible films that are currently hard to recycle? They're classified as hard to recycle. Can you change the composition from an engineering point of view, from a physics and a research point of view, to make it fit for purpose, which is preservation of food, for example? I think Justin probably knows exactly what I'm talking about. Freshness, the also leakage, and all the other things that are important. How do you still maintain those qualities in a new form of packaging? I think that's very important. And companies and research organizations are starting to look at that. Another point is talking about how do you make things reusable? And again, there are organizations out there who are looking at, instead of making things that are only single use, can they come up with something that consumers can reuse and be incentivized? To Justin's point earlier, how do you get them to be incentivized to reuse some of those things? I think it's very, very important, because some of the research has shown that for HDPE, high density polyethylene bag, a plastic bag, if you use it once, that's the benchmark. But if you take a paper bag, you need to use it 3 times for the same carbon emissions. And if you get a cotton tote bag, you need to use it 131 times, because of not just the disposal. We need to think about the entire life cycle, which is sometimes overlooked. The production of it, the cutting down of trees, processing the pulp to make that paper bag that you get at a fast food joint, right? So these are things that need to be talked about a lot more. And there is also something to be said about putting a lot more value on plastic. When the corporates see it, and they're beginning to see it, and the consumers see it, you will see that people want to get into the recycling loop instead of just thrashing it anywhere it is, just coming from a plastics point of view. And some research has also shown that by converting, let's say, 20% of single-use plastics into reusable plastics is a $10 billion opportunity for businesses. So I think the incentives are there, and it's being picked up by the businesses as we, as time progresses, as technology progresses, as people's mindsets change and the regulations come into place. And of course, there's the, much talked about plastics treaty that's coming, and it's going to be, put in motion in 2 years' time. So now it's the plastics instruments that the countries are coming together to discuss the boundaries of what that is.
Yeah, if I may react to that, Arun, I think it's a bit too much of a black and white thing to say that you have to prioritize the environment over profits. Because as Derek just explained, there are ways to pursue both. And there are opportunities to be a responsible company while still also retaining the profit side. It's really just utilizing and innovating, utilizing technology and innovating a lot. And science has a very critical role to play. So financing science or funding science, scientific innovations as well is very important.
Kelly, I'll come to you quickly. Do you think is that a messaging challenge, perhaps, this idea that environmental protection and profitability are kind of mutually exclusive, that companies that are very profitable are perhaps not prioritizing environmental protection?
Yeah, I think that last point that Marla raises is a really important one about innovation and technology. We work with a lot of companies doing lots of research around sustainability and ESG issues. Climate change, as you pointed out earlier, is the hot button topic, to the point that most consumers equate their understanding of sustainability to exactly that. It's about climate change. And with that, companies should be talking, and all organizations should be talking a lot more about this. And because there's some great stuff going on, there's great innovation, there's great technology happening all across Asia Pacific, but there's some sort of reticence, I guess, to get out and sort of put your head up too high and talk too much about it, because in some cases that's also wrapped up in the discussion around just transition, and industries that are trying to transition to be better or do better, reduce emissions, and I think there is with that a lack across the board of, as you say, real focus on having what's your climate change narrative, what's your climate messaging, what's your story in this space, how are you getting out and telling that alongside everything else. And there's quite an interesting finding, another interesting finding amongst the many in the study, that we asked consumers in the study about what emotions they feel in relation to different issues, and in relation to the issue of climate change, most feel concern and frustration. This is what comes out highest, and there's very few that actually feel guilt about this issue. And I think that points to the fact of people see this as something that is happening to them, not that they have control over, like a lot of these sustainability challenges, and are looking to public and private sector actors to help solve them. So I think getting out and talking about this in any fashion is a good thing for any business at the current time. And I think that will continue to grow.
That's quite fascinating, actually, because also, a concerned and frustrated consumer is not necessarily the easiest kind of person to communicate with either, right? So it poses a challenge, and it links quite well with the next question, which we've seen, the findings show, I think, a lot of concern, as you put it, on a range of issues, and even frustration, but less inclination to act on these concerns. For example, Derek, you mentioned single-use plastics, and despite everything we know about the backlash against single-use plastics, 16.4% of the respondents are against a ban. So that's 1 in 6 are against a ban, which is more than the proportion recorded 2 years ago. It's a 3% increase. Secondly, when people are asked, who's making the strongest contribution in terms of these sustainability challenges, they say that the consumers themselves, they themselves are the most underperforming. So there's a lot of concern, there's frustration, there's less inclination to act. And I'm curious to know how business can perhaps help bridge that gap. Is there work that can be done to change consumer behavior here, to perhaps make consumers part of the solution? Or is it still perhaps too challenging? Maybe Derek, if I could start with you.
Yes, Arun, I think that's the number one thing that I find quite distressing, that, while they acknowledge the problem is there and it's a complex problem, they don't see themselves as part of the solution. So it's quite alarming. And one of the things that I wanted to get the message across today was behavior change is very important. At the Alliance, what we do is we work with across the plastics value chain. We work with the different brands that produce products that are encased in plastic, like the detergent bottles and what have you. But we also work with local governments. We work at the policy level, at the UN level. We work with NGOs at a local level. We work with schools. Everyone needs to play their part. But I think there is still a lot of behavior change that needs to happen. When people do not see the value of plastic, they're just going to carelessly toss it away and just say it's somebody else's problem. I'll give an example which I read about. So if some people say that plastic is bad, right? There should be a ban on plastics, full stop. But a couple of considerations need to be talked about, right? For example, what is a good replacement for plastic? So if companies start to believe that without thorough research and fact-based findings, they might say, okay, I'll replace it with some other material. that may be produced at a higher environmental cost, emissions-wise, carbon footprint, and also might be harder to recycle. So I think that there's a lot to be said about how you do that. But some businesses are also going a certain step, or some governments, in terms of having an EPR, which is an extended producer responsibility. And I think for Justin's case is really, really good, that you provide a take back of the waste product that you produced, the waste of the product. So one good example is the Beverage Container Deposit Return Scheme, the DRS. You put in your bottle, used bottle in the vending machine, and you get some sort of a coupon or voucher or credit or something. And that is the incentivization that needs to happen. And in certain countries, like in one of the Nordic countries, I think Sweden or Norway, the recycling rate for bottles, PET bottles, is about 98%, which is amazingly high. And even in India, where you might think that the waste management may not be as good, the recycling rates are really, really high even. And the first thing that gets skimmed off are the PET bottles, because the value is there and it's easiest to do a closed loop recycling one-on-one. So back to my point about the value of plastic. Do people see the value of plastic? So the banknote that sits in your wallet or in your purse is made of plastic, probably. But you don't see that lying on the ground or being tossed aside or in a landfill. You never see that, but it is plastic. But you see every other kind of plastic trash. So the value of plastic needs to be instilled in things that businesses can recover. There's a $120 billion opportunity to recover the plastics produced and get it circulated back in the economy. That means jobs, that means good for the environment, it means health, issues are addressed because there is recovery and diversion from the environment. So I think we need to go from a convenience approach for consumers, demand less from a consumer convenience point of view, to a caring point of view, because every individual action helps, and no one party, not one business, not one government can do it. It's going to be taking a village to do that.
Change how the problem is framed. Justin, I wonder if you can perhaps share some of the strategies that you're using to perhaps help consumers and customers feel like they can be part of the solution here.
Yeah, thanks, Arun. I was listening to Derek's, I guess what Derek was saying, and I guess the one word that I want to focus on here is waste. Because I think the challenge is that what we're really asking the consumer to do is to hang on to waste and to do something about it. Now, I would say that I think for a brand like ours, I think the challenge is that we take a premium positioning in our category, and it's very difficult for us to talk to people about waste. Now, we've tried to change the conversation by talking about recycling, but recycling is still really talking about waste. And I think what we're looking to do now is to really try to reframe the conversation around circularity. So instead of thinking of something as waste, because waste would generally suggest that there's a very finite endpoint at the end of all this, and this is waste. We want to talk a bit about circularity. And one thing that we recently did was at one of our boutiques at the K11 Museum, which is a very nice shopping mall in Hong Kong, we opened the farm. So we call this Refarm because we wanted to showcase the whole circularity journey. And what we did was we put a recycling machine at the entrance of this place. So you start the journey by recycling something, and then you see coffee being composted, and then you see a farm at the back of it, and the farm produce is actually used by restaurants within the building, as well as hotel restaurants within the building, to cook dishes. So the reason we did that was because if we want to try to reframe the conversation from waste to circularity, we can't let people see these things that they've just used as waste. We need to show them, I guess, a nicer experience where you can see that this is actually something that has a second life to it, or has a different journey that it can take after it produces your coffee. And one thing that I find very interesting is that when people see the recycling machine, I guess the first reaction that they have is, and we invite people to put the capsules into the recycling machine. The first reaction they all have is that, oh, this doesn't look as dirty as I thought it would. Because if it's dirty, then the moment that you put it there. And then when they walk to the composting bin, they said, but this is fine. I mean, I thought composting is smelly. I mean, of course it is, and we had to use airtight containers and things like that. But but what we're trying to do is we're trying to take away the stigma of waste and try to turn it into something where you're contributing to something that grows something else. Now, it's a very new thing for us. I mean, this is a world first for us at Nespresso. So, and we've only started doing this for a couple of weeks, so I don't really have a lot of data to share. But I just want to use it as an example of how we can actually redefine the conversation. I mean, for us, it's really about circularity and turning into food. I think for plastic, there's a different conversation to be had, and I think there are certainly many different ways to have this conversation. But I would say that the starting point is really to move away from waste and to turn it into something that you feel has a use somewhere else.
Yeah, what I'm hearing here is just it's a lot of suggestions in terms of how to reframe the issue, and actually points to another finding in the study, which is the importance of messaging and simplicity and just the language that is used, which I think is critical as well, right? Because I think sometimes the terminology can be confusing. Sometimes, as Kelly said, people can just feel concerned and frustrated that they don't know how to be part of the solution. Marla, let me come to you. How do you see, how do you view those concerns? How are you acting on them, whether in terms of helping customers be part of the solution, but also in terms of the kind of messaging and the importance of language that's being used?
So, from my experience in the sustainability space, what I've realized is it's very important to recognize that we are using different languages when we talk about sustainability. So, for example, the definition of sustainability itself comes from the language of the development work that is used by the United Nations or other, global institutions that work with governments, with states, and with agencies. So it's a bit academic. It's a bit vague sometimes, and not exactly as specific in terms of metrics as compared to when you use ESG, for example, which can sometimes be interchanged with sustainability. And this is an accounting term which financial institutions use so that there is a more specific metric, baseline, or target by which they can measure the impact of their environmental activities, how they impact social, and how they measure their governance. So that's the language of finance, the language of accounting. And then there's also the language of corporates. When we talk about people, planet, and profit, that's really companies trying to reframe it within the perspective of a corporation and how it looks at its stakeholders. So it's all different languages, and you have to know when to use which language to better um, communicate to your target audience. So in my case, for example, talking about sustainability and its definitions was a bit difficult for our senior leadership initially to understand. But when I began to use the terms used by um, in terms of ESG, then they're able to understand it. They can see that, oh, okay, this is part of how we impact the environment because these are the projects that we finance, and this is the greenhouse gas emissions of the projects that we finance. Okay, this is social because this is how it impacts our customers and their livelihood, how it impacts micro, small, medium enterprises that we finance. And then when you're able to articulate and use that, and banks in particular, we're not really very, we weren't really very communicative about the initiatives that we have around these things. When we are able to phrase it in a language that the ordinary customer can understand, then that's really when you can make them realize that this is how the bank is making a difference, and this is how you as an individual can contribute as well. So language is very key, and the context is key. These are all basics. As communicators, we know this, But for sustainability in particular, which is such a broad and complex topic, it becomes even more important to identify what perspectives we will use, what lenses we will use, and what type of words we can use to better explain it in a simpler manner.
Thanks, Mara. That's really interesting and really helpful, I think, because I do think it actually contributes to quite a lot of consumer confusion. Kelly, over to you. Is this something that you see as well in terms of your clients? I mean, is messaging still a challenge, or at least simplicity in messaging?
Yeah, like I think the point about behavior change, which almost everyone has touched on, is a really important one, and stepping back and thinking about how does behavior change happen. Typically it's happening because people understand if they do exhibit a particular behavior or take a certain action, then it's going to make a difference, or that it's going to lead to something for them. And I think you do see still, if you look critically at how organizations are communicating around sustainability challenges, whether it's climate change or biodiversity or whatever it is, there is a bit of a gulf at the moment between, the kinds of, it's not just the messaging, but the imagery that's used and the way the issues are talked about. What does an emission or a ton of carbon mean to somebody? There's that sort of gulf between how it's been talked about, why it's important, they know they should care, but then how is it affecting their everyday life, and what can they be doing about it in everyday life to make a difference. So hopefully over time, as these challenges, well, nobody wants these challenges to grow, but they will. It's inevitable, and as that happens, hopefully over time, that sort of we'll start to see that gap closing, I think. And I think the organizations that are able to close that faster in terms of the way they communicate and engage with consumers will be ahead in this space, and helping to not only elevate their brands and businesses, but also in helping to drive behavior change effectively.
Yeah, and some very interesting behavior change suggestions that have been shared already. Please feel free, by the way, to ask questions. We've got about 10 minutes left, so please don't be shy. Let's talk about greenwashing, because I don't think we can have a discussion about sustainability, about climate change, about environmental protection, and particularly about how consumers view these challenges without talking about greenwashing. There is, I think, this kind of an underlying issue when we're talking about the efforts of corporates and of business, and sometimes even of governments to tackle environmental problems, that it will be labeled as greenwashing, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, but there can be a huge backlash. And I'm curious to know how that factors into your thinking when it comes to the work you're doing and when it comes to how you communicate about some of these policies. So Marla, over to you. I mean, obviously the financial sector already has got challenges, I think, in terms of how it's viewed on the environment. So how do you deal with the potential charges of greenwashing and the kind of backlash it can bring?
So key to our sustainability approach really is accountability and governance. And because we are a highly regulated industry, everything that we do is auditable. So when you disclose a metric or a target or an approach, or just generally disclose your activities around your sustainability commitments, then there really has to be strong accountability there. The problem is sometimes some banks or some companies still see this as a public relations exercise, and you can get a glimpse of it in terms of when you see where their sustainability office is connected to. They're connected to corporate affairs or corporate communications, or they're connected to investor relations because they see it as a PR activity for their investors primarily. And there are companies who, for example, would say that they are a strong champion of environmental protection and come up with a press release where 10 of their employees participated in a mangrove cleaning activity. So, that's how greenwashing starts, when you see this as just that, something to promote your company with, when in fact it's really a strong commitment that you need to live up to, and is increasingly under very strong uh, regulation, and under strong um, monitoring, I guess, in terms of how you are really living up to your commitments. So companies need to realize that, to be able to really be accountable.
Yeah, so perhaps a role for more regulation, as you said,
Yes.
to ensure that there isn't that much greenwashing. Derek, over to you. I mean, obviously, the Alliance exists to end plastic waste, but I imagine you yourselves have also not been immune to charges of greenwashing, right? So I wonder how you kind of handle that aspect from your own perspective.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you'll have people who support what you do and people who don't. And I think at the end of the day, you need to focus on your core mission. So what do you stand for? And just walk that line and be very focused on producing a lot of impact on what we do. So we feel that the impact conversation is very important, because we need to talk about facts when it comes to sustainability. What are the outcomes? So some of the projects that we put on the ground, or many of the projects that we actually launch on the ground, including building of transfer stations, building of materials recovery facilities, or what you call sorting centers. These take time. It takes financing, like from the banks that are supporting green investments, like Malas Bank. It also involves speaking with local governments for permits, for them to understand where they operate in the underserved areas, like projects we have in Indonesia, for example. Waste disposal is not a top consideration. So at the end of the day, literally, people at 5 p.m. start burning the rubbish in their backyard, or they toss whatever waste they have, including plastic waste, into the ravine that's behind the house, right? So there is no waste disposal. So how are people supposed to get into a circular economy, or to divert their waste from the environment, when the infrastructure does not exist? Now, and I spoke earlier about behavior change. When the infrastructure then does exist, and people have been convinced to pay a couple of dollars a month to get the refuse system going, then we can see the change, right? And then people will start to sort out. And then that's one level, right? Next level is, can you get people who understand recycling already, then to sort out? So these are the things that we need to do on the ground. And to do that, we need to build trust and credibility in the brand, in what we stand for, the members we stand for. And really, transparency is very important. So when we as a non-profit report, we need to report what are the impacts we're creating. So there's believability in that plastics plastic waste can be ended in a meaningful way, a sustainable way that benefits both businesses, the people, the economy, creates jobs, and actually it's going to be like what Justin was saying. We need to go circular and make it a point that everyone can do their part, and the impact will speak for itself. But some impacts take longer than others, because it has to do with mindset change and infrastructure building.
Indeed, yeah. So just a couple of minutes, Kelly, I wonder if you wanted to have the final word on whether the potential for backlash when it comes to greenwashing is it helpful because it's going to keep your clients more, it encourages accountability, or is it harmful in that it's making them too afraid, perhaps, to even talk about what they're doing?
Yeah, look, I think it's unsurprising, the point, it's come to. I think it's needed, and any checks and balances in this area, I'm sure any organization would say, are a positive thing. And I think ending on a positive note in terms of final comments, I think our industry and everyone in it has been doing a fantastic job in helping address greenwashing issues, over the past 12 to 18 months. And I don't think there's enough acknowledgement of that. Communicators are often on the front lines of organizations getting asked to push things out about brands, say things, make things happen off the basis of nothing. And, it's really encouraging and heartening to see communicators asking better questions, being less willing to push their organization out to be involved in something when it's baseless, and being willing to challenge that back in an organization because of the risks that now exist and are growing. And, with that, in many cases, certainly from what we've seen, drive positive change back through a business from the front line, which I think is great, and hopefully will continue.
Yeah, I have no doubt it will. I feel like it's a mindset change that, as you say, has been driven by communications people, and you're seeing it, I think, across business. And as we've discussed, I think it's one of the really important ways to ensure that consumers and customers can feel confident about their own ability to be part of the solution. So yes, that is a positive note to end on. I want to thank our panel, because we are out of time now. So Marla, Justin, and Derek, and Kelly, thank you all very much. Thank you to everyone who's attended. We'll be sharing a story on this in the coming days, and we'll also share the video as well extensively. So thank you all, and take care. Thank you.